Okay, so today's LinkedIn Live is what place does IGA have in a ransomware defense? So for this very important topic, we have risk and board expert Peter Gailey, and author of the Blueprint for Ransomware Defense. We also have ex-DoD and Homeland Security Chieftain Stacy Cameron. So hi, Stacy and Peter.
Hi, Ashley.
Hello.
Hi there.
Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. So, Stacy, please tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, always like to start off with, I'm a computer scientist who doesn't program. But that just goes with, I've been in the cybersecurity space, IT space for almost 20 years now. And I started as a system administrator, network administrator, database administrator, and integration tester. So that gave me the background needed for sort of a lot of the things that I do now, as far as helping enterprises develop strategic initiatives for cybersecurity and compliance, and really understand that connection between cybersecurity and compliance, right? So they're different, but they can work together, and they should work together beautifully. And that's sort of where I am now. I have experience around multiple industries. So I've worked private, assisted with private, public, commercial. I've been a federal employee on multiple occasions, a federal contractor, supported federal law enforcement, federal civilian, and the Department of Defense, specifically the Navy. So I've had a lot of experience in dealing with different regulatory frameworks and requirements, and even those other contractors, and providing them advisory services. So I really enjoy what I do. I always have a joke with, I did a PCI audit for a company one time, and they gave me a hug at the end. So this is, of course, pre-COVID, but it was like, who hugged their auditor? But it's just really being that trusted advisor to work with clients. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. And Peter, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. A hug at the end of a PCI audit. That's great, Stacy.
Good job, Stacy.
I'm Peter Gailey. My firm is Gailey Solutions. Been in the computer business literally since the 70s. It's last I counted 47 years in the computer business. I started off in data, in storage, in the OEM business. I've sold mostly selling my entire life, but I've had stints inside, staff assistant with President Fujitsu America. I created a division within Sun Microsystems that was 100 million in new incremental business in the first year. I've been around data and systems and high tech. My OEM background has given me a very, very diverse perspective on the computer industry and its growth over the years. Lately, last 10 years or so, I've been in the cybersecurity space. What my firm does is we help small, medium businesses and enterprises understand their cybersecurity needs. We start with assessments, people, process, and technology, and then form a program to be able to meet compliance needs and certainly reduce risk. Another group that we deal with is managed service providers, as we help them with those baselines at their clients to help drive the managed service provider services. So I'm Peter Gailey out of Dallas, Texas. Gailey Solutions is my company.
Perfect. So, Peter, your background gives you a special view on ransomware. So you even wrote a paper titled Blueprint for Ransomware Defense, right? Can you tell the audience a little bit about this paper?
Sure. You can find that on my website at for free, gaileysolutions.com. Ransomware is a tricky topic. It's the topic du jour lately. It definitely relates big time to identity and access management is a major component of it. But ransomware is kind of the scourge of the computer industry right now. There's a lot of different components on describing what it is, how it's perpetrated, and quite frankly, ransomware is just one of the many risks that companies face today. data exfiltration, data manipulation, all kinds of issues, and ransomware is one of the net results. That we call it white hats and black hats. White hats being good guys, black hats being bad guys. Ransomware is something that black hat folks are using to fund their businesses and their growth.
And Stacy, in your work with the DoD and Homeland Security, were you faced with ransomware?
So personally, the systems that I worked with, I was very fortunate that the systems I was responsible for didn't succumb to any ransomware attacks at the time. I've worked on many of classified and unclassified systems. So a lot of them have different increased security controls and air gap networks or out of band networks. So a lot of those instances we were able to. Now, sometimes that the users didn't always like the controls in place, but it was necessary for some of the type of data. But it doesn't mean that we were that we didn't succumb to other security incidents and have to work with various security operations centers to resolve them, especially dealing with that nature of data. So similar, there's increased attacks on not just U.S. government, but international governments as well. One of the things that I do appreciate especially during the pandemic, when even the government, when you're used to we're going into the building and there's we had to figure a way to keep everybody productive remotely. So now you're opening up a larger threat landscape and making it a little easier for as Peter was saying, the black hats to come in and do what they need to do, because you have a lot of different threats that you put in place, and just people are just trying to be operational, right? So you have a lot of people trying to work remotely at home. So it's simple enough for someone, maybe they hand their kid a computer and their kids do different things with it. So you just really open up yourself to more avenues of attack. So I'm really appreciative of the U.S. government for putting together various joint task force, the FBI, CISA working together, stopransomware.com, really getting materials out there free of charge for enterprises and organizations to really understand and sort of build out the resiliency around ransomware within their environments.
NIST, don't forget NIST, right? Big time.
Yes, and NIST is up the street from my house, so I've been there a few times and worked in a couple of working groups with them.
Sure.
Okay, so let's get into it. So in a recent joint release by the JRTF, the Joint Ransomware Task Force, in their Stop Ransomware Guide, it stated that one of the key defenses against ransomware is the practice of least privilege. So Peter, what does that mean?
Least privilege is really pretty easy to understand. You want to have your communities, meaning your employees, your clients, people that are trying to find out about your business, or it even plays in your personal life and your personal world. Least privileges is about data protection, and having those different communities have the ability to access the data that you want them to see, but not have access to data that you don't want them to see. So you want to give them the quote unquote least privileges in order for them to see what they need to do their jobs, or to do their functions, or to purchase things or whatever. But again, you don't want to give them privileges to everything. And I can give you an example for least privileges. You don't want to have a new employee have access to corporate financials where they can manipulate financials, or get into the corporate checkbook, or get into sensitive corporate data. You want to set them up with a governance package and an identity that says, hey, here's the stuff you can see to do your job, and maybe some other things, but least privileges, we're going to give you the privileges that are appropriate for your job, but only those privileges. Okay, so I don't know, are we going to get into scope creep again? We spoke about that before, but or privilege creep, but least privileges is really all about just maintaining identities and identity access to specific data that's appropriate for that person.
And in your practice, Stacy, do your customers understand what the least privilege means?
Generally speaking, I would say a lot of them understand what least privilege means, but where it comes down where they need additional assistance is usually on implementing least privilege and maintaining least privilege. Peter touched on it just a little bit about least privilege scope creep, right? So privileges change as your job function and needs change, as roles change, as people move throughout organizations and onboard and offboard and what have you. And not to forget that privileges least privilege principle needs to be applied to not just user accounts, but system accounts as well, right? So you want to make sure the right systems are accessing the right services. And I'll even add on that part of least privilege, and this happens a lot, especially you hear it when you're dealing with systems of various levels of classification. You can have someone that's authorized for secret systems, but they may not be authorized for a particular project or certain data, right? So there's that need to know. So not only are we looking at it from a least privilege, from a control and identity standpoint, but we also go beyond and looking at the data that Peter was discussing before. Do they need to have access to particular data? Just because I do a similar function as my neighbor does not necessarily mean I need to have access to those same projects. So that's usually where I see organizations need a little help with that, and just monitoring it and keeping it current and accurate to make sure that they can thwart some of these potential threats. And it could be unintentional, right? So we're not just talking about a bad actor coming in, but if your privileges, and this happens, we're seeing it a lot with all these breaches, with all these attacks, privileges, there's a surplus of privileges, right? So you need to make sure that you're applying these principles to at least mitigate some of those issues and shrink that threat landscape.
It's all about controls and governance.
Yeah, I like when you guys took that about the controls, and that's, I was even asked about, a recent hack like the Tesla hack, and people were saying, okay, so what can I say? And I go, well, it's a little early to jump on it, but one thing we know about insider threat and insider attack is the way we mitigate them is through controls. Through how are we enforcing, and then how are we attesting to those roles. But I'll let you keep going, Ashley.
Well, let me jump in on that a little bit about the Tesla hack.
Yeah.
So let's create a really bad scenario. Okay, somebody breaks into the Tesla infrastructure. They figure out how to be able to get around within that infrastructure. They get to the satellite networks. Okay, from those satellite networks, they might be able to do very nefarious things. Okay, or they get into the rocket business and figure out how to potentially damage a payload or something like that, right? So least privileges, if set up properly, will the principles of least privileges will allow for the architecture to be able to firewall people off, to be able to get or not get to certain places, certain data, certain network access, certain systems and server access. So it's a complicated, it's not that hard to understand. As Stacy said, it's pretty hard to execute, right? I think YouAttest has got some services that make it much easier.
We'll get into that. Okay, good stuff.
Perfect. So Garrett, given that you're the certified ethical hacker, what is the technical relationship between least privilege and ransomware?
Great. Thanks for the intro. But here is where I see it from the hacker's perspective. If you break it down into like the cyber kill chain, right? And that's what you were implying there, Peter, right? Yeah. Cyber kill chain says, hey, if I'm a hacker, what am I going to do? I'm going to reconnaissance the enterprise. Usually, social means, whatever, it doesn't matter. Then I'll say, oh, okay, I did a reconnaissance. I figured out they have these resources, and therefore I'm going to use this known hack. They have this vulnerability, and they come inside. Okay, they execute the exploitation. What is next? Once you have a piece of malware, once you have an open port, once you have a logon, what is the most important thing to do? The most important thing is, one, to stay resident, and then escalate your privileges. Okay.
Right.
And if we have already given the accounts that are easily hackable, those are the user accounts, right? And we have already over privileged those accounts, we just did the work for the hackers. And that's not hypothetical. Palo Alto did a great study that said that 99% of cloud permissions are overly permissive, of cloud accounts are overly permissive. So in essence, what have we done? We have given the hackers we're doing half the work for them. They come up with some, a hacked account, they get offline, it's already has way too much privilege. They go in and they start exploring. And with the escalated privileges, what are they doing? They're doing lateral movement across the enterprise, and then they're trying to find valued resources. So that's from a hacker's resource, why we have to be locking down our accounts.
And Stacy, what do the regulations say about least privilege? Do they call out the need for this enforcement, especially around administrative accounts?
Absolutely. So short and sweet, your regulations and your regulatory authorities are requiring you to implement least privilege just across the board. Your auditors are being actually more scrutinized these days. So your auditors are going, because they're being more scrutinized, they're paying it for it. So your auditors are going into more details and evidentiary discovery to verify that not only that you're implementing least privilege, but it's continuously being evaluated. So a lot of your frameworks now are going away from just these point in time assessments, but you have to demonstrate that you're continuously maintaining these compliance. You didn't just do well on your test the day your auditors show up, but you're consistently maintaining your systems and the same level of due diligence that you demonstrated during your audit period. Enforcement definitely around administrative accounts is always and definitely explicitly referenced, and that has been for years, but things are starting to see, and again, as what Garrett was talking about, what Peter was talking about, that you're coming in, you're escalating privileges because you started off with an account that was overprivileged anyway. So now I'm starting to see more within your frameworks and your requirements and your security controls that they're focusing on some more general user accounts, and your service accounts just don't get past an all-time pass anymore, that you have to demonstrate you've done your risk assessments and your risk analysis, and that you're monitoring and reviewing and updating and demonstrating showing you're doing these things. But you have your general accounts, remote access, right? So there's increased level of remote access for all types of accounts. And when you're looking at administrative and privilege accounts, there's varying levels of administrators and varying levels of privilege, right? So it's not just one. A lot of times it used to, back in the day, you've got root access. You go do what you need to do. But no, we have our administrators that we can wall off to just the specific function. They're a DBA, so they're just going to focus on the database aspects. They don't need to touch some of the other things. They don't need to deal with DNS. They can coordinate with those other aspects. So, and that's a lot of things that you're doing to help when, you don't want it, like Garrett said, we're making it easier. We don't want to make it easier for them. We don't want someone to pick on low-hanging fruit or easy target and then just start escalating their privileges without being addressed or picked up or alerted or an attack thwarted within our environment. So those types of things are definitely coming out in your regulations across. And I work with a lot of different standards, and it's been consistent. A lot of them, even I like to see as they start evolving, they're starting to not rebuild the wheel. They're leveraging existing standards, even within like your DoD side. DoD have their directives, and NIST had their standards, and they're working together with using these standardizations with NIST, even with the utilities in the energy sector, with NIST standards and ISO standards and what have you. So a lot of them are referencing these same industry-wide and international type standards, which is great for all you guys out there listening. It's great for your organizations, because a lot of you have multiple frameworks or you're working in multiple industries. And every time you come in, you have your security questionnaire. Are you doing this? Are you doing X, Y, and Z? But, you're able to do like these unified control frameworks and those types of things to really cover really large areas, and definitely least privilege.
I have to think, Stacy, that the critical infrastructure and the guidelines around that are just spell that out. the least privilege
And
has to be enforced.
and they've improved over time. So I do recall like critical infrastructure used to leave a lot of it to, you need to protect this, you have to do this, but they didn't really tell you how to go into that level of granularity that we were typical used to getting from this, but they've definitely improved and expanded and have added that specificity. So yes.
Yeah, I think it needs to be said that access control is one of the pillars of cybersecurity. No matter what framework, no matter what standard you're looking at. Stacy just, I think, mostly spoke about regulations and government specific. It also totally plays across every industry, right? So when you think of HIPAA, okay, HIPAA is the healthcare world. It has pretty much the same controls. You just, the controls are relatively the same. The questions are relatively the same. You just may answer them with a little bit different slant when you're being audited as it relates, you might answer it with, as it relates to healthcare versus maybe a government agency or PCI or something else. But everything is control, in cybersecurity, it's all controls based. And it's either standards, which are very specific, or frameworks, which are a function of best practices, right? So some of these requirements we speak about are very specific standards. FedRAMP, CMMC, right? PCI, those are specific standards that have got hundreds and hundreds of controls that you have to be very precise in how you address them. Whereas if a framework, something like HIPAA is a framework, and it just suggests best practices on how you would become compliant. So you're not certified in HIPAA, you are compliant in HIPAA practices. Big difference between certifications, standards, and frameworks. So depending on the industry, depending on the kind of data, but every one of those frameworks or standards has access management, and that's both at a personal level and at a data level. So when you're talking about access management, it's information specific and it's individual profile specific as well.
And Peter, in your world, what have you seen are the ramifications of not following the principle of least privilege for the accounts you've seen, especially around ransomware?
Well, I like to go to examples. One of the very specific industries is the credit card industry. The credit card, and this is it's interesting because PCI, payment card industry, was created by literally 5 big credit card companies, and they refused to wait for the government to set the standards for credit card transactions, and they said, hey, we have so much risk, we're going to set our own standard. Payment card industry, okay? So they have very specific rules. It's one of the most difficult certifications to get, most onerous, and a way around, not a way around, let me say it. If you are an enterprise, you have got a very large environment generally, and what you want to do is segregate your credit card transaction portion of your network, meaning you want to just, it's called a CDI, a card data environment. Anything and everything to do with that environment, you set that up in a subnet that nobody else can get to, okay? And you do risk assessments, vulnerability assessments, and pen tests to hammer on that environment to say, okay, nobody can break in, okay? Or if you find parts of or some of the results that may not be sufficient, you're going to have a gap analysis and you need to fix that, okay? That has to do with least privileges. You only want people in that CDE looking at that card data that are appropriate. You don't want the person on the shipping dock being able to get into the CDE. If that happens, then that is a breach of privilege, and you will never pass a PCI certification. And if you don't pass a PCI certification, the credit card companies are not going to allow you to take credit cards. right? They're not going to allow you to do transactions until you fix that. Not only you fix that, but you have to prove that you fixed that, right? So least privileges is very important. That's an example of the privileges that they set around data access into that card data environment within the PCI space. Take that example and replicate it into the federal space, into the DoD. Right now, one of the new standards that's coming out, it's not 1,000% baked yet, is called CMMC in the Department of Defense ecosystem. They have a set of data that they're trying to protect. It's called CUI, right? So this critical data within the ecosystem of the Department of Defense has to be protected. It's critical, unclassified information, but it is critical enough that you need to lock it down, right? We don't want our adversaries getting to this data. So it's this the CDE. The way I look at it, the CDE in the PCI world is very much like the environment that you can create in the CMMC world. You don't have to have the whole company certified. You just need to have that specific environment certified.
I like where you took that, Peter, because this is what I was explained by wonderful people like Stacy and Peter and y'all, is that here, you start with what your data is that needs to be secure. Your CUI, your controlled, unclassified information, that's what the CMC is, or the PHI, your personal healthcare information, or your PII, which is, they reference more financial. Start from there. Then
all about data.
Who has access to that server? Who has access to that database? Who has access to that web server? Who has access to that application? Who has access through the SACE environment to allow that data to go out? That's the way we in to out. We agree with that, Stacey?
Absolutely. And you're just touching right on into data governance. And I'm
exactly
just sitting here
right.
Checking the time to see how much time we have, but that you definitely have to understand that data classification and categorization. And then when you're implementing, and the way to implement it a little bit more resourcefully is you come up with your data governance policies that also say, okay, this environment, this is going to be in our CDE. So this is the CDE. This is type of data that's permitted in the CDE, and you can have that environment over here. The same as with some of your other environments that have sensitive information. And sometimes some organizations, it's not always the large organizations or even medium business. Your small businesses, you have a file share, right? So we're like, here's where we keep our IP, and it's only here, and we can lock this down easily. You can do things within your means and leverage tools like YouAttest to help you with your governance as well.
So it sounds like enterprises need to start looking more closely into who they've granted privileges and what access they currently have. So what are your thoughts, Stacy?
Yes, absolutely. Right. We see this all the time when I'm working with clients. You need to evaluate any type of internal exceptions, right? This is big, right? When you have your regulatory or your frameworks, and then you have your security controls and what have you, a lot of times within these governance processes, there's a risk acceptance and a risk, and you do an evaluation and analysis, and you're saying, okay, we need to have this, and it may violate your least privilege, and you're choosing to violate that for whatever reasons. You can't just say, okay, we need this for business operations, but you have to understand, why are you using these types of actions for business operations? What other mitigations and what is the intent that we're trying to do? And have I put additional security controls in place to make sure the intent of the original requirement is being met or exceeded? So those are the pieces that you really shouldn't forget when you're really putting this in and reviewing them within your environment. And also, a lot of people haphazardly just inherit controls when they're working with different third parties. And unfortunately, I've had clients who are inheriting full-blown attestations. And I'll give an example. Peter was using PCI, so I use the PCI one. Is, with PCI, if you're using, if you have an attestation of compliance for a particular component that you're using, then you're able to use that, and your auditor does not have to assess that aspect. However, because there was some overlap, I found out that one of the attestations of compliance was pretty much not compliant, right? So the paper said they were, but in practice they weren't. So those are the things that when you're working as an enterprise, you want to work with. When you're working with different vendors, there's still a level of trust but verify. Yes, you have this attestation of compliance or this report, but when you start handing over data that you're responsible, and then you're now in a form, now you're liable for what's happening to this, you need to add those extra steps that I don't always see that's happening. And that's even with least privilege as well, because you want to make sure you don't just give your vendor one account and they have access to the world and then they disperse it however they want to on their other side. You have to be very specific, and you can do that. And you can do that during your contract phase and your SLA phase.
Let me take that to another layer. You could be using Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, any of the large cloud providers, and yes, you get their certifications and you're trying to piggyback on their certifications, and that's great. Those are very, very secure environments, but it depends on how you configure those environments. It depends on how you transfer data, depends on the access of the people and the privileges that they have to be able to manipulate that data. Just because you're using a certified cloud partner does not mean that you are certified. You can't piggyback to that level of certification.
Yep, read the fine print.
Yep, exactly right. And a good auditor is going to catch that pretty darn quick.
So, Garrett, what are these tools called? And don't they fall under the category of IGA, identity governance?
Both Peter and Stacy were hinting at this. Well, here you go. You got your wonderful IAM tools. The world of IAM is wonderful. It's Okta, it's Azure AD, it's Ping, it's JumpCloud, it's OneLogon. They're saying, hey, these are the users, and this is what someone, usually an IAM administrator, has decided to give privilege to. And having come from the support desk, how are a lot of those decisions made? Someone yelling at you, okay? Make sure Bob has access. He can't do his work. Okay, rock and roll. So you add privileges. And that's, and Peter, you implied this about the 15 minutes ago. That's where privilege creep comes in. Everyone's just yelling at some admin. Some guy wants to go in with 5 to give them access. Rock and roll. Now someone has access to the database. Now someone has access to the web server. Now someone to the resource. Where is the governance? And Peter and Stacey both implied this. It's not necessarily built in, y'all. It's just not. Okay? That's where a process, a practice, and a procedure, and usually when we recommend it, YouAttest is a tool to come there that is IGA. It's under the category of IGA comes in, and then someone outside of Bob on a support desk, outside of Bob who's managing the Okta or the JumpCloud or the Azure AD, is governing who was given access to that CUI, to that PHI, to that PHI, PII, and CUI. That is governance. And that is exactly in the category of what we're talking about, attestation, and what YouAttest does. Take it away, Ashley.
The other piece on that is that that you maintain your log data so that when somebody does go to some place, you can figure out who, what, when, where, why, and what they got to, and why they got to it, so that you can review your governance. Let me put it that way.
And Peter and Stacy, why do you think customers are lacking in IGA? Peter, I'll let you go first.
In a conversation we had the other day, you asked about small companies and whatnot. I play in the mid cap, middle SMB and bigger, and lower end of the enterprise space. There are cost considerations, there are knowledge considerations, and if I'm a 25-person company and I've got one person in IT and they're trying to bootstrap it, they may not necessarily be aware of identity and access management. They'll have generally an intuitive knowledge of it, but they may or may not be using the proper techniques or tools or solutions, right? So generally, rule of thumb, I think pretty safe to say the smaller the
Would
company.
you be safe to say not even aware that the tools exist?
Yes, I would. Not even
Yeah.
aware that there's anything called identity governance.
Right. No, and
Or
I get it.
IAM,
I mean,
right.
that's why we built YouAttest around IAM. People know what IAM is. The last 20 years have been great. That someone said that was at the conference, it was, well, of course IAM, Garrett, it's the head of the snake. And I was like, perfect in the identity world. Great. What we need to do is add on from there. I'm sorry. Keep going.
So I was going to say that the smaller the firm, the higher the probability that they don't know and maybe don't even care about it.
Yeah.
And
that's why I like to work with GRC experts like you and Stacy, because you're advising them, saying this is what you need, rock and roll. You got this going, you're running your business, but you need this piece.
And oh, by the way, it's pretty inexpensive. And oh, by the way, it's very comprehensive. And oh, by the way, it's pretty easy to implement. And it's got a whole bunch of features that, and in my world, they reduce your risk and they contribute to your compliance efforts.
So Garrett, let's talk more about YouAttest and everything that we're talking about with IGA.
Thanks. Absolutely. Well, I get to talk. No, about a YouAttest. That's going to really be hard. No. Okay. This is the world that Stacy and Peter have detailed. That, we have this data, and we have all these regulations, and we have these hats. Okay? How do we actually start implementing the principle of least privilege? Given that we all know, pretty much agree by this time, that we need to do it. That's what, Peter, you wrote in your paper. That's what, Stacy, you've been doing in your day job, right? Is helping people implement this. How do these organizations, big and small, do that? Okay, given what I just said, that enterprises all have some IAM. It's 2023. It's not 1985. They've got something, and this was my world. This is what I literally was one of the early implementers and integrators of LDAP and Active Directory, and then moved out from there to building my own IAM and then exiting out of that. Enterprises have an IAM. You have Okta, JumpCloud, Ping, etc. Okay? What we built at YouAttest is a simple plugin. And everyone's like, well, Garrett, only 50% or 80% of my resources are actually in the IAM. Yeah, that's the exact truth for every single customer we have. Okay? That some number between 50 to 80% of their actual resources are integrated with their SSO system. It doesn't matter. What you have as a functional IAM shop is a tool to execute an IGA. All you need is a YouAttest plugin. It plugs into your Azure AD, plugs in your Okta, plugs in the other IAMs, right? And then you utilize it to attest to the roles that are in the applications that is governed by the IAM or not. User APIs, we have connectors, we have CSVs. We got one customer actually manages 65 megabytes that they upload to it. And then they have thousands of users attest to those roles. The concept, the value is, we talk privilege creep, we talk lateral movement, we talk privilege escalation. How do we mitigate that? We mitigate that by working with your existing IAM and then attesting to the roles. These roles have to be attested and removing them. Come on, the world's dynamic. This person left. This person went to the other department. This person shouldn't have that application anymore. And that's what YouAttest does. Plugs in your IAM, figures out what the roles are, sends out messages, automated messages to the managers, auto delegation. They attest or not to the roles. And then the privileges get removed. Take it away, Ashley.
Perfect. And Peter, can you tell people how they can get a hold of you?
Sure. My firm is Gailey Solutions. It's Gailey, Gailey, solutions.com is my website. Certainly, I've got a LinkedIn personal page, a LinkedIn business page. You can find me on Twitter as well. So Peter Gailey, Gailey Solutions. Easy deal. Phone number, email on all of those different vehicles.
Awesome. And Stacy, can you tell people how to get a hold of you?
Absolutely. So thanks for having me here. It's been great speaking with you, Garrett, and Peter. But yes, so you can find me on LinkedIn, Stacy Cameron. It was my LinkedIn, the link to my LinkedIn page was included on the invite. You can also find me CyCam Strategies. I am CEO of CyCam Strategies, www.cycam.io, or you can email me at info@cycam.io.
Perfect. And then us at YouAttest, you can contact us at info@youattest.com, and we'll execute on your identity governance and anti-ransomware and compliance needs. Thank you so much, Stacy and Peter. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ashley. Great job. All the best.